It's like really. I mean, part of it is like not having a social life, right, and having 3 kids and like just being at home all the time and like, okay, what am I going to do? I guess I'm going to write. No, it's a little more complicated than that. But, so the idea of today's talk is to discuss how I really got interested in folk tales, folklore, how I have decided to retool folk tales and retell them in different settings, and also how that led me into studying Mesoamerican mythology and studying Nahuatl and things like that, and how I use that also in writing young adult fantasy and other things. So I guess you could kind of say my passion is all things having to do with Mexico, with the Mexican culture, the Mexican American culture, the Southwest of the U.S. in general also really fascinates me because of that connection. And it informs all of my work. So, I mean, to really understand this, you kind of have to understand where I come from. And, of course, Dr. Cummins mentioned some of these things. I grew up mainly in the Rio Grande Valley, though my dad was in the Navy, so we lived for about 7 years of my childhood in South Carolina, which is both very different from the Rio Grande Valley and very similar, especially where we lived, which was mainly African-American communities. But when I was a very little child, a lot of my cousins and me would get dropped off at my grandmother Garza's house. And my grandmother, Marie Garza, she was the storyteller of the family. And we all loved to be gathered around her rocking chair. And she always, in retrospect, seems really, really old when I think about it. But she was probably like my age or a little bit older. And she seemed ancient to me when I was 4 years old. It's kind of funny. And she would tell us these great stories. And my family's like ethnically diverse, which is an interesting way of saying we're like a bunch of like mishmash. We're mutts, but Mexican American mixed with Southern Anglo on my dad's side, and then on my mom's side, Anglos that came down to the valley during the Great Depression, out of like Oklahoma and so forth. Former farmers and things. And so, I mean, the storytelling of my grandmother mixed like Southern Gothic with Mexican American and Northern Mexican storytelling topics and styles. And so, I mean, her stories, she would mix stories from the South with stories from the Rio Grande Valley and from Northern Mexico. And it was kind of great because, the kinds of stories that I grew up with. So we're talking about the story of like La Llorona, right? Las Lechuzas, La Mano Pachona, which was like the thing that she scared me with the most. It was the threat. Like anytime we were disobedient to her, there was going to be some hideous creature that would come up and drag us away. And of course, we know how these stories are used, right? They're often used as a way to get little kids not to do dangerous things. And it just seemed, because, look, I have 3 children. The youngest is now a freshman in high school, so we're almost done. Right. We're almost all gone. 2 daughters in college, the oldest of which is taking longer perhaps than I would have wanted her to. But there are, most of you guys will remember when you were kids or you have siblings, some of you may even have children, and you tell a child, don't do this, and that is the thing the child is going to do. Okay? Look, I put the candy here in this thing, but I don't want you to eat any of it because it's for later on, okay? Don't eat any of the candy. And you walk to the other room and the kid climbs up onto the counter and eats the candy, right? So there's this this idea in our culture that in order to really protect kids, we can't tell them the truth because they're going to ignore us. If all they're worried about is our disapproval, that's no big deal. My parents are going to be mad at me for ni modo. Me arriesgo. I'll take that risk. But when you tell them that some hideous monster is going to get them, kids take that kind of stuff seriously. They're like, oh no, okay, I'm not going to eat the cookie if La Mano Pachona is going to crawl out from my bed and drag me into the darkness. That's not what I want. Go to sleep, or, El Cucuy is going to come and get you, right? And you guys have heard these stories, right? Think about the nursery rhymes we sing to our kids, right? Duérmete, mi niño, duérmete ya. Porque viene el cucú y te comerá. Wow, that's just really, really awesome. If I don't go to sleep, a monster's going to come eat me. This is great, right? And then it goes on, right? Y si no te come, él te llevará hasta su casita que en el monte está. Oh, that's fantastic. So if he doesn't eat me right away, he's going to drag me off into the woods, hang me up, and wait till later to munch on me. That's just great. Like, I want to be a snack for later on. And so growing up with these stories, was a really, really neat thing. And we were almost all boys. I had one cousin, Christy, who for some reason didn't get dropped off with the rest of us when we were being taken care of by my grandmother or some other relative. And if it weren't the stories from my grandmother Garza, there was my uncle Joe Casas. We would go to his ranch and he would tell us spooky stories around a campfire. My aunts in the kitchen, my aunt Linda Garza, and all these other people just telling us stories as we grew up, and it kind of gets embedded in your mind. And then I began. My mom taught me how to read when I was very little, so by the time I was 5, I was reading, and then I started exploring adventure books and scary books, and it led me eventually to science fiction and fantasy, and eventually led me to literature. And before I knew it, I was, studying English at UTPA. Well, I guess it was just the University of Pan American at the time, Pan American University. And trying to figure out what I was going to do with an English degree, because there's not a lot that you can do. I got married partway through that career and realized that I guess I was going to be an English teacher because my wife wanted me to get a job. I couldn't just keep studying, that kind of had been my plan, but I got a job as an English teacher. Now, the third year I was teaching, I was at a middle school in Donna, where I still work to this day. And right after lunch, I had a group of kids that were very difficult to reach. And some of you are thinking about, going into teaching literature and so forth. And one of the things that you're going to have to come face to face with is the fact that most people don't like to read. And then if they're struggling to read, because it's, English is their second language, or they have other types of difficulties, whether they're cognitive or socioeconomic or whatever they happen to be, you're coming in, like I did, with the state-adopted text and opening it up to like The Story of an Hour by Amy Chopin, or The Scarlet Ibis, or any of these ridiculous stories that are difficult, rewarding but difficult to read. It's not going to go over well with them. And this is exactly what happened to me. These students would just throw their arms up in the air and say, "Chale, sir, no le entiendo nada. I don't understand anything. What do you want me to do?" And after a lot of soul searching and talking to my wife, and talking to a friend of mine, Javier Garza, who ended up being a children's author as well. He was the art teacher across the hallway from me. I began to realize that look, are those images of his right there? Yeah. Okay, that's super cool. Yeah, he's a great guy. I began to realize that what bridged the gap for me, what made literacy come alive for me and made me want to read, were the stories that I had heard as a child. Those are the things that served as kind of my entry point into literature. So with some guidance from Javier Garza and other people, I started using Stories That Must Not Die by Juan Sobajo, great collection, bilingual collection of short stories, well, like really, really short stories, like microfiction, basically. And the kids ate that stuff up, man. I photocopied the heck out of Javier's copy of that book, which was already falling apart. And the kids loved it. But soon I realized that I needed more than that. I needed to because I needed to teach short story elements, right? And I needed to teach actual literature. And I was a writing teacher as well, so I needed to teach them to write. So I began to realize that I could take the stories that my grandmother had told me and embed them, contextualize them so that they became literary short stories by, adding characterization, giving characters names and backgrounds, adding dialogue, setting the story in a particular time and place so that it felt more real, right? Which is what you kind of need from a literary short story. It can't be just a little folktale that's told around a campfire. It's got to be something more substantial than that, and you need to be able to embed, theme and foreshadowing and all this great stuff. So I began doing it. The first story I did was the story of Toluca Ranch. You guys heard the story, right? Toluca Ranch, about the guy who established Toluca Ranch, sold his soul to the devil, everybody says, and then built a chapel on his property so that he could hide inside of it when time came to turn his soul over to the devil. And so I wrote a rudimentary version of that back then. Kids loved it. I started showing them how to do that with their own stories at home. They would go and do kind of like ethnographic research with their grandparents, jot down the stories and then craft their own short stories. And I did this for several years. I taught it at school for like 8 years. And at the end of those 8 years, I had basically half of my first book, The Seed. And then I had also been doing a little dabbling and writing short stories that, even though they weren't retellings of folktale, still used the legendary milieu of the valley. It treated the valley as if it really were a magical place where these kinds of things could happen. and wrote stories that were set in that place as well. And that's what basically got me into it. During all this, of course, I'm also like thinking that I'm going to be like the next Ernest Hemingway and write the great American novel and stuff like that. But I gave up on that eventually because I realized that wasn't what I needed to do. And some of you guys, and I could see from some of the questions that I got, some of you may be aspiring writers. And the one thing I want to tell you is that right now, what you think you want to write may not actually be what you want to write, because there are needs that are deeper than your superficial understanding of your art. There may be things that you haven't discovered about yourself. And for me, because I wanted to be independent, because I didn't want to be, I was like rejecting my family for many reasons, one of them being that my father abandoned us when I was a teenager. I kind of had turned my back on, I guess, my dad's culture, his family. I was trying not to be, you've known people that like this. They have, I want out of the valley-itis, right? And everybody's so desperate, I got to get out of here. This is a horrible place. My oldest daughter has this attitude, like, oh, she's living in Austin now. And she's like, oh, it's so much better in Austin. I'm like, it's the same no matter where you go. People are people, whatever. You just like being in Austin because you're far away from us and we can't, no te estamos fregando, right? And we're not bothering you all the time. But, with those kids that day, and I talked a little bit about this last week at TED, something happened, something clicked, and I realized something about myself. That I had been neglecting, and writing these stories with these students helped me to rediscover this really, really important part of myself, and it led me down a path that I'm still on to this day. And after The Seed came out, I started collaborating with Noe Bella, who's a painter from Mexico who lives in Edinburgh now, and we started working on Mexican bestiary, which is a bestiary. It's like a medieval manuscript. Monks, after getting a little tired of praying and reading the Bible and stuff like that, would say, hey, let's make like an encyclopedia of like unicorns and griffins and stuff like that. And so it's just the way they would spend the rest of their time when they weren't gardening or reading the Bible or praying, right? And if you ever look one up, you can find them online. Beautifully illustrated encyclopedias of imaginary creatures. And so we wanted to do something like that for Mexican creatures, and it was a lot of fun. We made it bilingual and so forth. But in doing research for it, because we wanted to have creatures from all of Mexico, I started, moving away from the border culture that had been my entire life, and began exploring deeper in Mexico. Now, I've been married to my wife for a while at that time, and we had lived in Monterrey and stuff, but still, northern Mexico. I mean, even though we had like visited Oaxaca because we have friends down there in Huatulco, it was really northern Mexico that was like the world for me. Northern Mexico and the Southwest United States. But as we began to do this book, I began to study more and more about the legends and myths, and I started reading actual codices, translated into English or in Spanish from the Aztecs and Mayas, and I became obsessed with all of that, and I wanted to read them in their original language. So I started studying Nahuatl, and it led me to translating poetry from Nahuatl into English, because there are translations of this stuff, but it's not, it's not written in poetry really. There are a few like smatterings of poems that have been written by poets, but they usually are not translating from Nahuatl, they're translating from Spanish, or they're using somebody's like transliteration of the Aztec text to create a poetic version. So I did that, and this is just, it really, really informed everything else that I've done. So that my YA fantasy series is deeply embedded in the mythology of the Aztecs, or the people that we call the Aztecs. They never called themselves the Aztecs. They were different Nahua tribes, and each one of them had a different name, right? There was the Mexica, and they would have never called themselves Azteca. Well, we call them that now, but they would have taken offense at it, because for them, the Azteca were the overlords in Aztlan, whom they had run away from, which is why they were in central Mexico, because they left Aztlan. They didn't, people were always like, oh, take, Aztlan. They were fearful of Aztlan. Aztlan was, like a horrible place that they had escaped from, and they were happy not to ever go back to it. So it's kind of ironic the way we see things now, 500 years ago. And this is one of the things that studying it has revealed to me. And when I went to school, we never learned about the Aztecs or the Mayans, not like that, not their mythology and so forth. Right? You guys learned about Greeks and Romans. You probably studied Norse mythology. And at no point, I'm going to bet, did you study Aztec and Mayan mythology and religion and things like that. You studied it in world history in a cursory way, historically. And you didn't really dive into it. So it's been really, really fascinating for me. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Smoking Mirror. Okay, that's the first book of Garza Twins. Now, somebody asked me the question, and so I'm going to start like referring to questions here because it'll help to inform this talk a little bit. Somebody asked me about the idea for the Smoking Mirror, where it came from. Well, I'm a big fan, among all these other things, of like YA fantasy series. When I was a kid, I read like the Chronicles of Narnia and the Lord of the Rings and all those kinds of things, and I just kept being fascinated with that all my life. When I had children, I exposed them to that, and then I continued reading with them whatever fantasy series was popular at the time. So I've read, all the Harry Potter books and like all the Percy Jackson books, and just name a series that's come out in the past 20 years for young adults, and I've probably read it. Even Twilight. And my daughter will one day pay for making me. She was a teenager, and I was like, man, I'm going to need to read this with her. She was like 12, 13 years old, and can't just have her read this by herself. And I read it, and it's addictive. It's like eating like really, really crappy candy, but it's like so sugary, that you're just like, you keep eating it because you're like, gotta eat more. And then I came to the last book, and I threw it across the room halfway through the book. I was like, wow, finally I come down off my sugar high and realize what I have gotten myself into. It's pretty sad. But one of the things that always frustrated me about this was these books typically, and of course, there'll be a token person of color in the books, right? There'll be the black friend or the Latino friend, right? Or whatever it happens to be. But the majority of the characters are Anglos. They are typically, in fact, middle class WASPs, right? And they are fighting against European monsters or gods or whatever it happens to be. Sometimes they'll throw in like Egyptian, because, ooh, that's really exotic, right? And I was remarking at a conference to some friends of mine, Jason Henderson, and a couple other people who write this sort of thing. I really am frustrated that I pick these up, and I never see like a Chicana fighting against like Aztec gods. I want to see that one day. I want to open it up. And I went on a rant, and basically they told me, well, you seem like really, really passionate about this. Maybe you should do it. And so that's what I did. That summer, I sat down and wrote it. And it actually wrote itself like in just 3 months. It just came out of me. The idea initially was, because I was like, okay, what am I going to do? It's really easy to say Chicana versus Aztec gods, but where am I going to go with it? And two different things. There were two like images or occurrences that really inspired it. One of them was, I was driving to the movies with my son Angelo and my daughter Charlene. My son Angelo Giovanni and my daughter Charlene. Some of you already start going, okay. Angelo Giovanni, right? That's Angel, John, or Angel Juan. You reverse it, you get Juan Angel, which is the name of the protagonist of the book. And then Charlene is basically the French version of Carolina. So you can kind of see that they're definitely. And we were driving along, and Angelo's 4.5 years younger than Charlene, but she's kind of small. She's like very thin, and kind of like meek or whatever, and calm, and very tomboyish, and he is like bigger and more boisterous, but he's like also kind of soft emotionally. He's like a nice guy who always wants to help people and gets very upset about social injustice or gender inequities and things like that. And he's always like advocating for women, and they're just we're driving along, and they're talking and laughing and having a good time, and they always are this way. And and they'll like kind of playfully insult each other. But I realized at that moment, they don't have a lot of other friends. They're like best friends. She was, I guess she was like, I want to say she was like 15, 16 at the time, and he's 4 years younger, but they spend all their time together. When he's at school, he's got his friends at school, and sometimes they'll come over like once a month on a weekend or whatever. But the majority of the time, all their interests coincide. They spend time together, and she's a sophomore in college now, and she graduated a year early. So she's still 18, and he's a freshman in high school. But they still spend like 4 hours a day together. It's really, really interesting. And I thought to myself, wow, this is really, really unique. You don't see this a lot in literature. You don't see siblings male and female siblings, older and younger siblings, like being best friends like this. In fact, I thought it's going to be so hard to convince anybody this could happen that I have to make them the same age. There's just no way. And since people always ask me, are they twins? Because at that time they were about the same size. Angela is significantly taller than she is now. People were always asking me, are they twins? I remember Jan Seal, the poet laureate, when she first met him, she's like, wow, they look like, fraternal twins, are they? I'm like, no, they're 4.5 years apart. And I knew right away, that's what I wanted. I wanted at the heart of my book for there to be a brother and sister. I wanted them to be fraternal twins, and I wanted them to have to confront the Aztec gods. So now the question comes, how? And I kind of had this basic idea of using Mictlan. Mictlan is the Aztec underworld. Mictlan has 9 different layers that you have to go through after you're dead. And a person in Aztec mythology took 4 years to go through these levels. And each one of the levels stripped away another part of your physical essence and it disconnected you more and more from the physical world until you reached the center as a pure spirit and were able then to pass into whatever lies beyond. There were different... I mean, people want to see Aztec religion as a monolithic thing, but they were different sects, if you will, that we've lost a lot of the information about them. But it's pretty clear from reading their poetry and so forth that some of them believe in reincarnation, others believe that the souls just went and joined with Ometeotl, which is the dual god from which everything is derived. But whatever happened, you had to be a pure spirit by the time you reached the throne room of the Lord and Lady of Death, because they would then decide whether you could pass through. And if you still had, if you had any vestiges of your human existence, they weren't going to let you through. So I knew that I wanted to do that because it was really fascinating. And you had to have people were buried with a dog so that the dog could accompany you on your voyage, because there were rivers you had to cross and you weren't going to be able to cross on your own. So the dog would paddle its way across and you would hold on to the dog. And I was like, wow, that's such a great idea. But then I didn't know why in heck they would be in heck, right? So that was a really bad joke. Toning it down because I saw a little child in here a little while ago. So one morning then I woke up and went outside. I had to let the cat in. He was scratching at the back door. The sun was, how summer mornings are. It's already hot outside. The sun is already out. It's 8 o'clock in the morning and it feels like it's noon. And I saw in the backyard, red, a smear of red. And I'm like, oh, God, what has the cat killed now? And so I walked over, and there was a dead jackrabbit. And in my mind, in a flash, I saw my daughter laying on the ground with the jackrabbit in her hands. I'm like, okay, that's a really cool image. Why would she be laying in the backyard with a jackrabbit in her hands? And then I got it. Shapeshifters, nahuales. They're shapeshifters. And they're twins. So that means... And it was an avalanche of things. And when those two things came together, the book wrote itself. It was okay, I already have the structure because I've got to go through the 9 layers. So there's my structure right there. Don't have to think that very hard. It's clearly a quest. It's a hero's journey. It's a monomyth. I've taught this for years. This book is going to just write itself. And so all I had to focus on was the character of the two, of Carol and Johnny, to make sure that I got them, perfect, pitch perfect, and that I could differentiate between the two of them, and that they would have their strengths and weaknesses. Because my goal was to give, and this is, by the way, to correct Dr. Cummins, and it's not that she probably just doesn't realize this, but it's actually going to be a 5-book series, not a trilogy. So over the course of these 5 books, my goal is, and this is addressed in one of the questions as well, what I want to do is give so much power to these twins, put so much power in their hands, and make them realize that the power that they have is not enough. In fact, the power that they have is actually very dangerous, and it's not. I mean, I basically tell you what the point of the series is at the very end of The Smoking Mirror. When Tezcatlipoca, the Smoking Mirror, that's what his name means, that's what his Nahuatl name means, basically tells the twins, I've done this to you because I need to forge you into a weapon or into a tool, and I'm going to use you to break open the cosmos and let the Tsitsimeme in. The Tsitsimeme being those demons that have been sealed away that devour stars and will come down and destroy the earth, ushering in a sixth age. Because this is what Tezcatlipoca wants. He's disgusted at humanity. He's disgusted with, because he's a trickster god. He's a god of chaos. One of the things that's going to be really, really hard, I think, to balance well is that he's not an evil god. He seems really, really evil. And he's bad. There's lots of really horrible things. He's no saint. He's not a god in the Western sense of the word. He's a figure of chaos. But he serves a function, and he believes that it's time for his function to be served, and that is to tear down order so that new order can be created. And this is part of the very dualistic notion of the universe that the Mesoamerican people had. So the book opens, most of you guys have read it, the book opens with the twins 6 months after their mother's disappearance. No one knows where the mother is. The father has begun to drink really heavily. He's a professor here at the university in the history department. He's missing a lot of days. He's probably got somebody subbing for him. And the twins have also kind of grown apart. No one, they can't handle it. They don't have any answers. The mom didn't take anything. She's just gone. And as they're exploring their feelings and trying to get past the devastation, these weird things start happening, like Carol waking up with Jackrabbit dead in her hands, or Johnny freaking out at school and almost beating the crap out of the school bully. And they get shipped off to Mexico for the summer because their dad needs therapy, and they go to stay with their mother's sister in Monterrey. And while they're there, they go visit their grandmother in Saltillo, and it's there that they find their mother's journal and discover that their mother is a shapeshifter and that they've inherited her abilities. Because they're twins, they have Xochal. And Xochal is twin magic. It's something I translated as savage magic. It's something that can't be controlled, that not even the gods really truly understand. That's why Tezcatlipoca wants them, because they have a magic that can be used to break open the cosmos and bring about the end of this age. And so, their mom's been taken captive by Tezcatlipoca because what he wants to do is push them through the 9 layers of Mictlan so that he's pulling them apart from each other and twisting them and torturing them so that they're more and more likely to be, not to be willing instruments of his, but to have no choice in the end but to turn their power over to him. And so it's going to be a really interesting series because that's not what people want to normally hear from their heroes. They want their heroes to be, triumphant. They want them to take up the sword and chop off the dragon's head, and everybody's happy, and that's not the kind of story I want to tell. There's going to be happiness at the end of it. I'm not telling you that everybody's going to be dead at the end of this book, at the end of the series. No, not at all. But the lesson, and I think the lesson that I try to teach in Garza Twins is that at the very end, they can't defeat Tezcatlipoca. He's a god who's been around for hundreds of thousands of years. They can't possibly hope to defeat him. But what they can do is allow their love for their mother and love for each other to bind them together and be willing to accept whatever comes. And then he kind of has to back off because he doesn't want to kill them. He's not there to destroy them. And that plays into the next book that I'm going to read a sample from in a little while for you. So, I think an interesting mix of things going on here. The book has been pretty well received. I've gotten some good reviews. I'm going to be at middle schools in McAllen tomorrow and on Friday. I'm going to be at McAllen High School on the 28th. I'm going to be, I think, in Sharyland on the 23rd. I've been going to schools all over the place. The book, it's my best-selling book so far. It's not a bestseller by any stretch of the imagination. But of my measly titles, it's the best-selling book so far. So things are going really well. I'm hoping it'll get some recognition. I've submitted it for different awards, and there's more awards coming up. So even if I win one award, that's what happened with the translation of Aztec and Mayan poetry. When I won the award, that got a lot of press, and people bought a lot more copies of it. So that's kind of what I'm hoping. So I want to get the book out there to people. Does anybody have any questions so far? Because I was going to look at some of these questions really quick and answer some of them before I read to you a little bit. Because since I'm talking about Smoking Mirror, it seems cool to answer questions about it and then read to you from the next book. Yes?
Will there be a quest in every book?
There will be a quest in every book, yes. The structure is very much, but in every book there are more helpers. In every book it gets more complex and things begin to be built in. I'll touch on some of that. Let's see. So I love this great question. Would you consider putting a glossary of the Aztec gods in the back of your next book? I should have done this. I feel really, really bad about it. Many times, because I knew that we weren't going to visit very many of these gods again, that they go to Mictlan once and they're not going to ever go back there, and so the majority of those gods you will not see again, except for Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl, who are, they're going to continue throughout the whole series, and I guess Xolotl is going to come back in a little bit as well, the big dog guy, right? It just didn't occur to me. I was so worried about people not understanding the Spanish that I focused just on the Spanish glossary, and my editor never said, hey, you should probably put it. So I'm going to blame this on my editor. And I'm going to edit this out. I'm going to recording it, so I will edit that out before either the editor-in-chief or my actual editor hear that. But yeah, in the next book, there's definitely going to be, and I will include gods and figures from the first book in it. And then we'll probably, when we reissue the Spooky Mirror, then we'll probably add that glossary to the back of it as well. So I'm working on that. The question comes, how are you going to develop the characters in the next book? Well, see, the next book, A Kingdom Beneath the Waves, happens underwater. And it's just like a crazy idea. So I hesitate to say I like mermaids, because that just sounds really weird. But the idea of underwater kingdom of sirens and tritons and things like that has always kind of fascinated me. Like, what would their world be like? And so rather than go with something easy, I decided to send the twins under the ocean, under the Pacific Ocean, off the coast of Colima. And the reason for this is there are mentions of mermaids in both Mayan and Aztec texts. Now, there's not a lot of discussion about them, but they're talked about. And one of the things that's mentioned is that when the third age came to an end, it came to an end by a flood. And Quetzalcoatl saved some of the humans that were alive at the time by transforming them into fish. And so I thought to myself, and they were called, there were different words for them. One of them was tlacamichin, which means, literally means man-fish. And then there were, other words that were used to describe them. And so I thought to myself, what if, some of those had been turned into, mermaid-like creatures, and others had been turned into, creature from the Black Lagoon kind of creatures. And so I just started generating all these really great ideas. And I started, imagining, what that culture would look like, what kind of contact they would have had with humans. There was a lot of stuff. So that instead of, with the first book, I just took the story of the 9 levels of Mictlan and then took the Popol Vuh, which is the Mayan book that describes, as a big chunk of the book, how 2 twins descend to the underworld and defeat the demons that live there, and kind of mashed them together and used it as a plot. And this one I had to create everything myself, using some little strands of things in Aztec and Mayan and folktales and mythology, but crafting it myself. And a lot of it was, what's going to be the next step, how, at the end of the book, of book 1, there are questions that need to be answered. When you involve parents in it, they need to have a role, because I don't want for the parents just to be left out. You see this a lot in YA, because YA authors don't want to have to deal with adults. They're like, I'm going to make my characters jerks who hate adults, or I'm going to make the adults idiots, and the young people are going to. But in my culture and in your culture, that's not the way things work. I mean, if you're going to have Mexican American protagonists, their moms and dads and aunts and uncles are going to be all up in their stuff, right? What, you could shapeshift? Okay, a ver, siéntate, mija, vamos a hablar. What are you going to do with the, Cuidado con que comas demasiados tacuaches, porque no. Love the scene where Carol has bitten an opossum, and it's really disgusting. So I have fun with gross stuff, so it's kind of fun. So I definitely wanted to make sure that the parents were involved, and the twins have to be separated from their parents, but it needed to be organic, and the parents needed to feel like they were doing something, and because if you find out that your son and daughter are the keys to the impending apocalypse, and also probably the only people that could stop it, you're gonna be involved. You're not gonna go, okay, guys, go off and have your adventures. Let us know how Quetzalcoatl's doing and stuff. No, I mean, you're gonna want to be involved, and there's a reason that the father is a history professor, and there's all kinds of things that I front loaded into the story so that the parents would have a role to play. So definitely the parents are a bigger part of the upcoming story. And they begin to learn things in this upcoming book about shape-shifting twins and iterations rather of them throughout the millennia. And they hear a story of perhaps the very first shape-shifting twins and like what that led to. So it's really, really cool. I'm having a lot of fun writing it. Let me see. Another question. Why did you not include more Spanish in the book? So this is a fascinating question. I mean, I put a lot of Spanish in the book, in my opinion, but the characters spend a good part of the time in Mexico. And so here's the deal. This is what somebody might do. They put characters in Mexico, and they don't have them speaking Spanish. They're using English the way I did to represent Spanish, but then they include Spanish words in. And I want to know, what does that represent? They're already speaking Spanish, and suddenly you have a word in Spanish. Like, why, So if I'm gonna represent the Spanish they're speaking in English, because otherwise I'd be writing it in Spanish and having footnotes, and nobody does that. I needed to represent it as English, and that's just the way it is. So when they're in Mexico and they're talking to people, except for obvious times when they're talking together in English, you can kind of tell from context. They're using Spanish, and so in effect, there's a huge chunk of the book that's in Spanish, but we have it translated into English for us. And then, of course, when they're in the underworld, they're not speaking English or Spanish. And it's really tough to kind of explain this, but this is a spiritual realm. It's not a physical realm. And everybody could be speaking whatever they're speaking, and they all understand each other. It's not. So I put this Australian publishing company, they were really accepting of the Spanish. They just wanted to make sure they had a glossary with lots of Spanish in it. Other authors, more radical, like Chicano writers, would probably put a lot more Spanish. Even Guadalupe Garcia McCall, who's by no stretch of the imagination a radical Chicana writer, puts more Spanish in her book than I do in mine. But it's also because, think about you guys, who's read Summer of the Mariposas? Anybody? Somebody has read. So Guadalupe Garcia McCall, good friend of mine, she wrote this fantastic book, Summer of the Mariposas. And I always like to tell her, they're set in the same universe. And she's like, yeah, David, yeah, they're set in the same universe. She's really nice about that. Because the sisters, their last name is Garza. And so I'm like, they're like the distant cousins of Johnny and Carol. But, they're working class. And obviously Johnny and Carol, their mom is a middle-class Mexican who moved to the United States and married a college-educated man who teaches at the university. The mom's a sculptor whose work has been exhibited all over the place. And I haven't really gotten into it, but we'll find out that cities commission her work and stuff like that. So they have money. They're not working class Mexican Americans. They are upper middle class Mexican Americans, and that's a different kind of life. And one of the biggest, and a friend of mine posted on this on Facebook just yesterday. One of the biggest things in the Mexican American writing community is this notion that somebody should be policing other people's versions of being a Mexican American, right? Or what it means to be a Mexican American. There's a huge debate. There are people who are very politically activist who believe that any writing you do that is not about the struggle is a waste of everybody's time. And I'm not one of those kind of people. I also believe in writing to preserve things, writing to represent different ways of being and so forth. And at the end of the day, I just want to tell a really good story. And I'm really fascinated by Mesoamerican mythology, and so I embed that in there. But I'm not necessarily trying to make a political statement, although there will be some political statements. Some of the things that I do, it just naturally comes across. But I'm a kind of moderate person. I'm not a radical, either to the left or the right. And I respect probably left radicals more than I respect right radicals. But I don't have, I'm a pragmatist about the world. I'm a realist. You have to survive, and you have to be flexible about certain things. Somebody asked me here, who exactly was Xoloto the dog? Well, Xoloto, if you remember, he kind of explains a little bit who he is. He's the spirit twin of Quetzalcoatl. Imagine if Johnny and Carol could pull their tonal out and have it be like there next to them, so that it would be Johnny walking along, and next to him would be his jaguar self, separate from him. That's kind of like what you have with Quetzalcoatl and Xolotl. And Xolotl, there's like all kinds of like cryptic stuff in the story that only pay off later on, and maybe not even in the series, because Garza Twins is the young adult component of a much larger universe that I have, in which I write different stories. I have a collection of short stories coming out in probably February or March, and this has not been officially announced, so I can't post it on Facebook or whatever, but I'll tell you guys. It's a collection of short stories called Chupacabra Vengeance. And these are not like young adult short stories, they're adult short stories. And some of them are stories that have gotten published in different professional magazines like Strange Horizons or Apex or so forth, and others haven't been published yet. And in it is a collection of stories that are kind of like happening in the same universe. And in fact, they're republished from the seed are two stories that basically are in the same universe. So Xolotl has been incarnated before on Earth, and that's when you see him turn into a human, and he remembers the turn of the century between the 1800s and 1900s and Nickelodeon stuff like that. It's because he was in human form in the late 1800s, and that there are stories that are written about him at that time, and it'll pay off in the long run. And then when they come out of the underworld, their mother seems to know him. So she sees Xolotl in his human form, and she's like, "Are you him?" And it's like very, very vague. And the implication here is that she thinks he's Christ. She thinks that he's Jesus Christ. And he's like, "No, but I'm a part of him." And so there's like this syncretic notion that behind like Quetzalcoatl and Christ and so forth is like a reality that these religions are just like facets of. And I don't go into it very much because it's like a young adult book, but I wanted to leave something there for adults to go, "Oh, okay, I see what he's trying to imply." And it's just a fun way of because I want to write something that is fast-paced and appealing to young people and, some snarky dialogue, stuff like that, but I also want to write something that is going to be rewarding for adults to read and for them to see the deeper, religious and philosophical implications of the stuff that I'm talking about. How much time passes in the book? About 2 months. So the book starts kind of at the beginning of May, and it ends kind of by the end of June. Until this question was asked of me, I never had thought about how long it took. But I knew when it basically ended, but I never really thought about the time period, because when they're in Mictlan, time is running differently for them a little bit. So. Other questions? Is the father a Nahuatl too, or a creature with other powers? No, he's not. He's absolutely not super powered at all. Okay, he's got other issues that come out, and he actually, if you read Juventud, there's a story in there about him when he's a teenager. The next book, when this is coming out, late next spring or early summer. What kind of research did you conduct? I guess I kind of already talked about that a lot. Why did you choose a wolf and a jaguar? Well, jaguar is an obvious one for the Mexican culture. Wolf, and remember, this is she's like a what are they called? Is it kind of like a red wolf or a timber wolf? It's not a timber wolf. It's a red wolf. It's a Mexican wolf. They're small, kind of scraggly looking. Poor Carol. And she's a little bit bigger than a normal one. I mean, they're humans in animal shape, so there's a degree of a size difference. But you would think, because they're born on the same day, according to the rules of Nahualismo, they both should have the same spirit animal. But because they're twins and they have Xochal, all bets are off. And so there's a reason that she's a wolf that I can't freaking tell you, that you will find out if you read the entire series. So there's a reason for her being a wolf. And it's not a nice reason. No, well, it's not the reason you might be thinking. It doesn't have anything to do with parentage. Oscar is her dad. Okay, there wasn't any. I'm not gonna throw that into a upper middle grade or YA novel. Mom having a little fling. No, nothing like that. Why did you choose them to be different sexes? I think I talked to you a little bit about that, about wanting to reflect their friendship between my son and daughter. The obstacles that I selected was because of the actual story of the underworld. Let's see. I'm trying to see if there's a question I haven't answered yet. Oh, have young readers told you that this made them interested to learn more about the cultural materials of the book? Yeah, I actually have gotten a couple emails and responses from people that are like, wow, this is really cool. And I was at SciTech the other day presenting to some students there, and it got one of the kids really, really interested in Aztec and Mayan mythology. So it does have that impact. I definitely wanted that to be one of the reasons that I was writing about this. Why did you include the city of Donna, Texas? Well, I've lived there for 19 years now. And I wanted to write about people on the border. I wanted to have a true reflection of what it feels like to be a middle-class family in the Rio Grande Valley who spends time in Mexico and has to confront the fact that, oh my God, well, I guess we're going to go on a bus because if we drive over like in our relatively nice car, we're going to get, held up and have our stuff taken away from us. So let's dress up in our crappiest clothes and let's get on the bus and like pretend to have less than we do. And it's like really kind of depressing that we have to do that. So I wanted to reflect. I didn't want to like beat people over the head with it, but if I'm writing about the world this past summer, because this book happens this past summer, and the sequel happens in December of this year. It's kind of weird. I'm writing. When it comes out, it will have already happened. But when this book came out, it hadn't happened yet, if you understand what I mean. And that doesn't make a lot of sense, I know. So. The gods and demons, those are real names. I didn't make any of those things up. It's all real, crazy Aztec and Mayan stuff, man. The demon that spews out ash and has like fire inside him, that's just insane. Only the Aztecs could come up with something like that. I couldn't have made anything up like that myself. So you got to love, though, the way she defeats the demon by throwing water on it and singing the little song. It's really cool. I loved embedding songs. It's tougher when they're underwater. But I have a really cool singing escapade in it with Carol turning into a humpback whale. Towards the end. I mean, I'm totally giving something away, but just all I have to say is just think about whale song, think about her having that power and what she could do with that like enormous, like powerful voice, right? It wouldn't come out in English, but translate some Mexican folk song into whale language. How did your teaching experience affect the writing of the Smoky Mirror? Because I wrote it basically to be like crack candy for kids. Yeah. Because I thought to myself, what were kids always asking me they wanted to have? Like, they wanted things to be fast. They didn't want a lot of description. They wanted like lots of action. They wanted, snarky, snappy dialogue. They wanted gruesome stuff. Like, come on, river of blood, river of pus, and so it's nasty. It's awesome. I had so much fun writing that stuff. It's great. It's like, let's torture Carol a little bit more. It's awesome. Somebody asked about parallels with my life. Well, I think I've kind of like hinted at them. I obviously teach at the university, although just like class a semester or whatever. I built a fictional family around a framework that looked like ours. My wife is from Mexico as well. She's not a sculptor, but she does a lot of recycled art. I based, because they just have 2 kids, I based their cousin Stephanie on my oldest daughter. I just like took people and like ripped out really interesting characteristics and slapped them on other characters, and like this is what writers do. We're kind of jerks about that kind of stuff. I can't wait till when I published it, Creature Feature, as Dr. Cummins mentioned, is on its 3rd year, and in the first year I was in an airport coming from Houston to the Valley from a conference, and I got a phone call from the editor saying, "Oh my God, David, they're going to sue us over your story." And I'm like, what are you talking about? The family of the guy at Damnation of Toluca Ranch has called us and told us that they want to sue us because this is horrible. You're telling that their ancestors sold his soul to the devil. And I go, they can't sue us. The guy's dead. And besides, this is a legend that like I heard growing up, and that my wife, this is the very first legend my wife heard when she came to the United States, whatever. But then they talked to the lawyers, the monitor's lawyers, and they said, "Oh no, don't worry about it. There's no liability. The only person that can sue for defamation of a character is the person being defamed. Once he's dead, no one else can, or else the descendants of Abraham Lincoln would be able to sue the guy who wrote Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer, or whatever the heck it is." Abraham Lincoln did not slay vampires. I'm going to sue you. That's this lawsuit mentality in the United States. And eventually, other members of the family thought it was great. It was just this like one woman and her like husband or whatever who were like horrified. I'm like, you guys haven't heard the story. You don't know that everybody in the valley thinks that your ancestor sold his soul. I go, I mean, I don't know how he treated his workers for them to like come up with a story, but if I were you, I wouldn't be so upset about it. It's just a story, guys. Okay, I'm going to